it seems to me that, you know, what we're seeing now, in light of coming very specific, for a very specific answer to your question, you know, is we're seeing the rise of fascism. I mean, you know, we're in the midst of a fascist moment throughout the world. That's being contested, of course, by young people, by indigenous groups, and so forth and so on. But we've got to figure out how this fascism works in updated forms, without simply relying on the assumption that if you don't mimic Hitler entirely, then you can't talk about fascism. I mean, it's just nonsense. I mean, it's just really nonsense. And I'm just shocked at academics who pursue this line. You know, I mean, as Iran said, as Sheldon Wolin, a whole range of people, you know, fascism emerges in different forms. I want to try to understand the different forms that are now emerging, what they're doing to undermine any viable conception of radical democracy, and what that means for individuals and social movements to reimagine different forms of collective resistance.
Yeah, it seems that the conversation around fascism, there's one camp that suggests that if it's not a fully blown totalitarian structure, then you can't talk about it. It's not really fascism. And then there's a group of people like you who draw on the tradition of the Frankfurt School and Hannah Arendt, who talk about it as a kind of style of politics.
Right.
It's not, that doesn't have to have like a totality of consistency. There are elements and tendencies, and they're latent within modernity and within modern societies, and even particularly, not particularly, but also liberal democratic societies. And we need to understand and analyze what those tendencies are. And I had an interesting incident, not incident, but we were reading your book Border Crossings in my class, and the updated edition. And the last chapter now from at least the newest edition that I had was on Abu Ghraib. And this was just a week ago, Henry. And I was really kind of taken aback by the number of students who said, one, I was in elementary school when that happened, or I was in junior high school when that happened, and it made me feel particularly old. But also simultaneously, they were making comments like, I never knew that occurred. I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know that the Bush administration, you know, had so much mendacity that they told so many lies and all of this sort of thing. So what I'm getting at here is you've written extensively about historical memory and its collapse. And I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit about that in relation to fascism and the fascist style of politics in the moment that we're in.
First of all, I think it's a terrific divide that in terms of the categories you've created. I think it's exactly right. And I must say, I may be too harsh with this, but I think those people who fall into the second camp, Corey Robbins, oh my God. I think these people actually become complicit in fascism, because it seems to me that they do something that we're talking about right now. They actually turn their back on learning from history. And, you know, I mean, there's something about learning from history that seems to scare intellectuals, except when you can rewrite it in your own interest and make the claim that, for instance, Poland never participated in, you know, in the genocide of Jews in Poland, which, as you know, they've just passed a law saying that's a crime if you bring that up. But I think that historical memory is absolutely crucial. And I don't think there's ever been a time when it's become more crucial. I mean, this business of trying to learn from history in light of a fascism that's reproducing elements of the past, that should be alarming. I mean, alarming. I mean, when you talk about racial purity, when you put kids in cages, you know, when you use the language of vermin and dehumanization, when you create policies that suggest that the Confederacy was basically the model for American democracy, I mean, to make the claim that there's nothing to learn from history about this is to blindside ourselves to the potential consequences of where this language leads. Fascism begins with language. And then it moves on to basically killing intellectuals. And then it moves on to killing anybody who doesn't fall into the category of ideological and political purity. I mean, my friend Zygmunt Bauman, before he died, I mean, God, he wrote a book on identity that would shock people today, you know, in which he said, look, he said, sorry, the language of identity as I read it, he said, the end point is Auschwitz, you know, and he was, you know, and he was on to something. And if you read that sentence today without having any historical reference for what he's talking about, you don't get it. You think this guy is a fascist. I mean, he's saying identity, there are different identities. He's not saying that at all. He's saying that identity has a propensity to become sclerotic. And when it does, it normalizes notions of exclusivity that basically mimic right-wing populism that mimics the logic of genocide in the endpoint, as an endpoint. And I agree with that. And I completely agree with that. And I think that, you know, it's funny, the great theorists of the 20th century and the 19th century, I mean, people like Adorno, I mean, people like Horkheimer, I mean, Leo Lowenthal, Rosa Luxemburg, they couldn't imagine theory without historical consciousness. You know, they couldn't imagine, you know, and yet today, as you said, you know, I mentioned John Lennon in my class, and they didn't know who he was. At Mac, John Lennon. That made me feel like, I tell people I was born just after Lincoln died. And they believe that because they have no sense of who Lincoln is. But you're right. I mean, I think as academics, we have an enormous responsibility to resurrect those histories that shed light on many of the problems that we're facing, and also to shed light on the way in which history gets distorted and produces narratives that have no resemblance to reality.
Well, yeah, Adorno writes in that essay on education after Auschwitz that the greatest danger is a reified consciousness, which is a consciousness blinded to its own historical conditionedness. And he also talks about the need for, welcome back, Amy, the need for education to transform itself into sociology, by which he means, and it's somewhat similar to C. Wright Mills, which is to locate the subject in history, to locate the production of consciousness as a historical event, as something that's produced within a totality of social forces. And it seems to me that, you know, the crisis of historical memory, at least in relation to the crisis of education, is very much related to that kind of absence. And perhaps you could talk a little bit more about the crisis of education, this crisis of historical memory, as being linked in particularly in the U.S. context and in relation to this rise of fascist culture.
The crisis of historical memory is, in terms of how it's related to the crisis of education, is in part about the crisis of time. And what I mean by that is that when you have institutions that are defined by simply the bottom line, the only thing they think about is short-term profits. They don't think about long-term considerations. They don't think about long-term investments. Historical memory becomes a nuisance. Thinking in complex ways becomes a nuisance. I mean, when basically you want to define people as either consumers or taxpayers and nothing more, and you remove from any notion of education what it means to view it as a democratic public sphere that in some way has to address questions of justice and its relationship to the public good, then the question of historical memory withers. It becomes dangerous because thinking becomes dangerous. But I also think that the thing that I find in the current moment that we probably needs to be addressed is that one of the ways in which neoliberalism basically survives is by isolating issues and not allowing issues to be connected, so that we say schools are failing. You know, the right wing says schools are failing. What they don't say is they're being defunded. What they don't say is that wealth and power are being mobilized to benefit the 1%. What they don't say is that the social state is collapsing, and in its place is the punishing state, and almost in which all social problems are now defined as criminal problems. You know, so it seems to me without those connections, without that, as you say, you know, that historical sphere to sort of inform people, the question of time no longer becomes contemplative. The question of time now becomes expedient. You know, it's linked to questions of efficiency. It's not linked to questions of thoughtfulness. I mean, I think Hannah Arendt was absolutely right when she said the essence of fascism is thoughtlessness. And she said all thinking is dangerous. And I think C. Wright Mills had it right. C. Wright Mills almost more than anybody else. I mean, when he talks in the sociological imagination about the foundations of what it means to be a public intellectual and engaged, the first thing he talks about is historical memory. talks about historical consciousness. You know, he talks about making visible those things that are often invisible. I mean, he talks about a comprehensive kind of politics. And I think all those things increasingly are absent from, it seems to me, the neoliberal university. I mean, the thing I find astounding in the classes I teach in an arts and science program, the best students in the university, undergraduates. I have one class a semester with them, and they're brilliant. They're just brilliant. They can write, they can think, but they can't make connections. They can't make connections. You give them an isolated topic and you tell them to write about it, and it could be published tomorrow. Making connections, they don't have it because they don't have the language. And I give them that language. And I must tell you, 99.9% of them come out of that class saying, wow, I have completely reshaped how I think. I don't think this way anymore. I am putting things together. I'm seeing things I never saw before. I mean, it's really retooling, if I may put it that way, their own possibility for a different sense of agency. I want to put on the stage a pedagogy that says, look, your agency can be more capacious. Its capacity can be more extensive. But for that to happen, you have to learn how to make connections. You have to bring things together. And historical consciousness is one of them. And you have to slow time down. You have to slow it down. You've got to find a way to slow it down.